This is the Anything Goes with Jackson Neill podcast. Welcome back. Episode number 129. I'm Jackson Neill. Today, Troi Irons. She's my guest talking about her latest project, Lost Angels. And before we jump into that, I want to remind everyone that you can listen to this podcast on all of your favorite platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. This one is there. And also, make sure to subscribe to get the new episodes every single Tuesday and Thursday. So, Troi just released her latest album, Lost Angels, a project that really is a kind of a concept album. She tells me that it's about the storyline she has all kind of mapped out, and listening to the project, you definitely picked up on it. I mean, I love the resolution at the end, but just listening to the whole thing front to back is kind of a cool experience, and I think that's something really awesome, because a lot of times in albums nowadays, you seem to maybe losing that a little bit, but with this project, she perfectly captured that kind of narrative arc to an album. So I talked with her about capturing that narrative arc, what she kind of thought and how she did that, and just a lot of other stuff surrounding this project. So let's jump right into the conversation. Can you tell me a little bit about this new project you have, Lost Angels?
Yeah, it's an album that I primarily produced on my own. It's a post coming of age album and story. Yeah.
Why that name Lost Angels? That really kind of intrigued me.
I called it Lost Angels. I wrote the title track a few years ago, and when I wrote the line, "Who do you run to in the middle of the city of Los Angeles?" I knew that was the title of the album, because the story, in a sense, is a story of being lost and then found, and not lost in the sense of losing yourself, because I've always had a really strong sense of self, but I have not always had a strong sense of my surroundings, because my surroundings have always changed, and especially living in a city like Los Angeles. I moved here for education, but a lot of people move here for the weather or opportunity and entertainment and to become a star. And so we don't have a culture here per se. I mean, obviously there's an indigenous culture, but the majority of the culture here is a ladder culture. It's a quicksand culture. People come here to rise to the top or sink. And so there's not really a community, and there's not really, it's hard to be grounded here. So I got a little lost there for a second, and then I found my way home. And that's kind of the story.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, and Los Angeles is kind of that place where it's very hard to meet someone from Los Angeles. It seems like everyone else is from a different place out there.
Right, yeah.
And I find that interesting. You mentioned, being lost. I saw this quote. It said that you moved around and you lived in a lot of different places growing up, but none of them really feels like your hometown. I guess, how much did you move around growing up?
I moved when I was born in Ackworth. No one knows where that is. I don't even know where that is because I couldn't drive, right? So I moved to Las Vegas when I was 6. And then when I was 12, we moved to Azusa, so I could go to college that was in East LA. And after Azusa, we were in Santa Clarita, and after Santa Clarita, I was in the Valley. And during my early teenage years, I was traveling a lot because I was on a label. So we would be in New York one week and then back in LA the next, or in a studio or in an office space. So it wasn't like I was in the streets of, say, Monrovia going to the movies with my friends every week. I was just always on the go. So it didn't really feel like I grew up any one place, because I wasn't in any of the places. I was just kind of, in sterile white offices most of the time, talking to people in suits.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the life of a label musician, I guess. But that sounds kind of wild, moving around a lot, growing up, especially that time in your teenage years, to not have that one kind of place, that one kind of, group of friends, that one kind of spot that's your hometown, your place you're from.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has a lot to do with the person I am today.
hmm So I want to jump a little bit more into this album. So how long of a process was it creating it? I saw you had an EP, Antihero, last year, but so how long did you take on this album? Because I heard you mentioned how that phrase "Lost Angels" was from a song you had written even years ago. So how long exactly it was a process making this debut?
Well, a lot of the songs, I'd say maybe half the songs were done before any of the EPs I released because my intention was always to release an album, and then the EPs were kind of uh, what's the word I'm searching for? The EPs were people were like, "Oh, we have to test the waters and do this EP," and I hate EPs, but I did them anyway. But they were just kind of like little side things. They weren't the main like they were microwave food, and then the album is this 5-course meal that I've been working on. So I think the oldest song on the project is 5 years old. Um, so it was a bit of a process. Basically, I wrote most of the songs, and then they kind of just sat on my hard drive as demos, and I would just keep um, changing up the track listing. I'd add a song here or take off this song there. Um, Really, I think the biggest chunk of the process, which was the production, happened over a period of 5 6 months. When we finally got the go ahead to do the album, I it was exciting because I'd always wanted to make the album. The process of like sonically creating this world that people can live in and people can deconstruct and that people can grow with over and over. You can't do that with an EP. I mean, maybe you can, but I think it's very difficult to do with 4 or 5 songs that are all supposed to sound like singles. Um, but yeah, I rented Spotify Studios and spent a little bit of time in the Pulse Studios, and it was a really fun learning process because I would finish one song, turn it in to be mixed, and be like, "Wow, I wish I did this in the production." And then I would do that on the next song. So I kept learning new things and getting new tools for every song. So it's it's interesting to me because I know the production order. I know which songs I produced first and which songs I produced last, so I can hear my own growth on the project. Like I feel like Damaged in terms of production. I think that's the production I'm most proud of right now because just I got this Marshall DSL 40 and it just sounds so amazing on the guitars. I really got into like guitar tones and just making it sound bigger and less, and more stepping away from the digital beat making production that was so ingrained in me from my early years.
hmm Yeah, I can definitely hear that. I definitely hear that. I do love the production on Damaged, and I found it interesting how you kind of were learning as the project went on. It's kind of a funny little observation. And I saw a quote from you about EPs. I thought was pretty hilarious. You referred to them as one night stands, which I have to agree with. I mean, you're right. When you have 4 or 5 songs that all sound like singles, it's hard to make a real connection with the listener because you can't really tell a story like that in that short and with that kind of brevity.
It, one night stand is probably the best description for me. I don't know if I can elaborate more on that, but EPs for me, it was different. I feel like with the release of this album, a lot of the fans and even musicians that I am acquainted with in real life, they've been messaging me and radio people, and they're like, "Oh, wow, we had no idea." I'm I think of myself as a musician, but even more so, I think of myself as a composer. And I think a lot of people didn't realize that because I wasn't able to put out my, I think in longer visions. So it's hard hard for me to compose for shorter periods of time. And I think Brian Eno said something like that because he was talking about how much he grew as a musician when he had to compose the Microsoft 5-second jingle. But yeah, I compose for longer periods of time because I think of an entire story, and I think this is the first time that people actually got to hear that is what I do. More than being like a songwriter or writing great hooks, I write entire stories. And a lot of people have been like, "Oh wow, we finally get it now. Like this is what you do. Okay, cool." So I feel understood.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, I could definitely that definitely comes through on the project. I mean, my favorite part of the project is I love that ending you have with the "I fell in love, hold on to your heart and home." I think the ending to that story that you kind of create and you compose throughout this album, I think is just so great. And that once you get to that last part of the project, you can really tell that, man, I just listened to like a story. I just listened to this whole multiple part story and longer thing than just some songs thrown together.
Yeah, yeah, it was important to me to kind of create that story arc, both lyrically and sonically. As you could probably notice that the last three songs they sound lighter. It sounds like you're coming out of a darker, heavier time into these songs that are just light and fluffy and kind of blue in color or light yellow for home. And yeah, I feel like in any transformation, it's not complete unless you have the, not rebirth, but I guess in a sense, yeah, rebirth. Yeah. It's not complete without the rebirth or the baptism or whatever you want to call it in your story arc. Yeah.
Mhm. So you mentioned right there, you were referring to the songs almost with corresponding colors. Do you look at I've heard this from a couple musicians. Do you look at your songs almost as, oh, the color red, or this is the color purple? I just find that really interesting. Is that something you do?
Yeah, I've always kind of been synesthetic, and I weave my songs. That's kind of how I weave a tapestry together. With like I put it all in a spectrum, and it has to flow together. And that's how I can tell. Oh, this song doesn't belong next to this song because these colors are not analogous. Kind of in the same way that someone would build a film. Like if you look at films and get into color grading and how they use colors to tell a story, I do the same thing with sonics. So yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I've always loved, in films looking at just how it's colored. But now that you explain it that way in music, I've never heard it explained that way. But that's a pretty cool observation and way to look at it. I want to get into a little bit how of your production. I noticed that on your last EP, Antihero, you produced it all yourself. That you did a lot of did the production on this one yourself. You mentioned how you were learning as you did it. You just seem like a musician that really likes to have the full kind of control over your entire sound, I guess. When did you decide to do that? When did you decide to say, okay, you know what, I want to not only be like the vocals and the writing, but I want to produce as well? And what kind of led you to that decision?
It was so after I got off my first label, I was 18, and or we were it was official when I was 18, but we were in the legal process when I was like 16, 17. And I think I was either 16 or 17 when I first heard Tyler Creator, and he has this line where he's like, "Well, you mean like an 18-year-old kid making his own fucking beats in his own videos? It's like the intro to Bastard on the first record." And he's talking about how he does all this shit, and I'm like, wait a second, you can produce your own music? Because I was a kid. I just come from this process where they put you in a room with two male producers and a female writer, and they kind of like tell you what to do, and like they have the computers and they have the equipment and they're the experts, and they're they've got these big houses in the hills because they've just done something for Kelly Clarkson or Pink or what have you. So what they say goes, and the suits trust them, so they're the people to be trusted. So that was the world that I was coming out of. And then I'm introduced to this like abrasive very not by the book artist, DIY artist, and it was like, oh, I did not know that was possible. And I was actually working on a couple songs, and I'd written them, the music and the lyrics, and I brought them to these producers, and they were like, okay, well, we're going to take 40% of the publishing. And I was like, wait, but they didn't write the song, and I don't understand why they're trying to do this to me. So that was like, oh, well, I will just cut them out of the thing entirely. And so I started on GarageBand. And then my mom was like, oh my God, please stop using GarageBand. It's terrible. That's not industry standard. Please, here, have Pro Tools. So she gave me Pro Tools, and I started learning Pro Tools. And then after Pro Tools, I started learning Logic. So yeah, ever since I was kind of 16, 17, I've kind of been growing in that. And it's just taken, some time to really get comfortable and come into my own. Because even after having that one seminal idea of, oh, I can do this myself, there's, of course, going to be the pushback. Like when I got on Def Jam, and my management, not the management that I have now, but the toxic management situation that I was in before, he, put me in sessions with other producers, and he wouldn't tell those producers that I was a producer. So I would come in with my guitar and like try to get in on the track, and they'd be like, what are you doing? Like, you're, just be an artist, just focus on what you're good at, focus on what you're supposed to do. And instead of being like, oh, you can do this to your drums, they'd be like, do you even know what you're doing? So it was this constant pushback. That's why I'm like, on the very first EP, Turbulence, I don't think there's a single track that I've done that I had produced on my own. I think most of those tracks, like, I wrote the song, then my manager had me bring it to a producer or something like that. So yeah, it's just been a process of coming into my own and being assured and sticking to my guns and being in a community that allows me to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it sounds like right there. First of all, the whole label situation, the classic kind of thing of, in order to get that kind of creative freedom, but also now coming with this debut project, you not only you're producing on your own, but you have to, like you said, come into it, learn how to do it, and then develop that sound. A funny thing I noticed there, your mom telling you, oh, you need to get off GarageBand, get to Pro Tools. I did a little researching, and I saw that your parents, they're musicians themselves, right?
Yeah.
How have they kind of influenced you? How have they, impacted your music career?
I think I have learned, I think the thing that they implanted into me was that I can do what I set out to do. Like, they never set a limit. Like, I grew up like seeing all my dad's plaques on the wall for like selling millions and millions of albums in the 70s. And I was like, oh, well, that's a normal thing because these are on the wall. So that must be what normal people do. Normal people sell millions of records and do what the fuck they want to do and play, tours for years. And they just do that full time. So it never seemed like unattainable. So I think that's probably the biggest thing I learned from them. And then as I got older and I started actually asking my parents questions, I found out that they produce their own stuff too. I just didn't know. And my dad, because my mom is more of like an 80s person, but my dad's a little bit older. He was in the 70s, and he would talk about the differences between the industry then and the industry now and similarities. Like, he actually had to argue, and everyone was like, you're crazy, you're not allowed to do that, because he was trying to get the same royalties as the pop bands got, because back in the 70s there was white radio and there was black radio. It wasn't like urban and pop, it was just like straight black and straight white, and you couldn't cross over. There was no like blending. Like, even Michael Jackson had trouble getting played on MTV in the 80s. So it was like a wildly different world. And my dad, like, I guess he offended a bunch of people and fired their lawyer, and found, a ton of lawyers find the one that would give them the right royalty rate. And just hearing stuff like that, like, oh, you did that? That's fucking cool. So you offended a bunch of people too. Okay. Well, I guess I won't like be so upset about people calling me difficult, because you got to stick to your guns, and like stuff that sounds crazy now in 30 years, people will be like, oh, of course you would do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of a really cool story there. And I mean, it must have been really, like you said, it must have been really helpful to have parents like that who are musicians themselves, especially when you're going through some label issues. So I just kind of want to wrap this up and ask about just, you know, your debut album is out right now. You finally were able to not just have a one night stand with an EP. You're finally able to have this longer project that you composed with the storyline. Just how are you feeling right now with this project out?
You know what? I think I finally feel, and this is kind of a weird word because it's got a loaded connotation, but I feel successful finally. And I did a TED Talk on this a while ago, but I define success as doing what you love, being able to do what you love and having that freedom. And I'm finally doing what I love. Like, I'm finally like living life and capturing the inspiration, and making observations on where we are as a culture. And I get to interpret that and then create music that I like, and art to go along with it, visual art to go along with it that I like, and merch that I wear. And I'm able to, one of my favorite things to do, probably as much as I enjoy making music, I enjoy writing. And now get to collaborate with people who are doing very interesting things in their fields, whether it's visual or literature. I finally get to talk to those people that I admire and create things with them. And yeah, so I'm getting to learn new things every day, and I'm getting to create things that I like every day. So I think I feel successful.
And a huge thank you to Troi for coming on to the podcast. Remember to go down into the show notes. There I have a link for you to follow her on Instagram, as well as to check out her album Lost Angels. I highly recommend it. That whole narrative structure, something really cool, something I personally love to listen for in albums, and I think this project really accomplishes that really well. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Anything Goes with Jackson Neill. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, make sure to subscribe and rate this podcast on your favorite platforms. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. For more episodes of this podcast, as well as my music and sports discussion ones, go over to jacksonneillpodcast.com. That is the archive for all of the podcasts that I publish. Now, if you're a really big fan, maybe consider becoming a subscriber over on Patreon. For just a couple dollars a month, or even $1 a month, you get access to cool bonus content from all 3 of my podcasts, including this one here, bonus content from today's interview even, with Troi, where we talk about our favorite movies, our favorite music, things like that. I write, record, produce, do everything for these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so any little bit of support just helps me spend more time making these fun episodes. If you want to stay up to date on everything I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at JacksonNeil20. Today's music is by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next time.